The ongoing debate at the core of the lost mythology is, did the Egyptian period come before or after Across the Sea? This video series would like to definitively put this question to bed. We do not know exactly when Across the Sea takes place in time, but, judging from the tools and clothing and use of Latin, it is estimated to be around 2,000 years ago. Many people assume that this means it must be taking place after the Egyptian settlement has come and gone from the island. However, the Egyptian era lasted for almost 30 centuries in the real world, and it overlapped with the Roman era. There was literally a specific period in Egypt's history known as Roman Egypt in which the Romans created a province there. Roman province Egypt still worshipped Egyptian gods and built statues to glorify these gods. Following the Roman invasion of Egypt in 30 BC, the use of hieroglyphics did begin to slowly die out, with the last known writing of them occurring in the 5th century AD. The point is, these two cultures existed alongside one another at the same time and continue to do so for almost 7 centuries. It makes sense that Egyptians came to the island in order to escape Roman rule and to keep their culture alive. The island was a place in which they could restore their civilization and rebuild the Egyptian empire in a new land. So, the matter of which civilization came first in chronological history really has no bearing on the island's own history. Across the Sea is taking place during the Roman-Egyptian period. Claudia's people came first. We know this, in part, because of what is omitted in Across the Sea. If the writers wanted us to know that this episode was taking place after the Egyptians had already come and gone on the island, then they would have shown us something related to that period. The temple, the statue, the lighthouse, the tunnels, the hieroglyphs, something, anything, but they don't. The island is intentionally depicted as being sparsely populated, with no structures or civilizations in sight. The caves are where Mother resides because no other structures have been built yet. Even the Man in Black's village is built from scratch in a clearing. Claudia's people are not inhabiting pre-made structures here, and it is never suggested that there are other people on the island other than Claudia's group from the shipwreck. When Mother meets Claudia in the beginning of the episode, the implication is that Mother has been alone here for some time. After all, if there were Egyptians still living somewhere on the island and having lots of children of their own, then surely Mother would have simply taken a baby from that community by now. She wouldn't be so enthralled by Claudia's arrival and her pregnancy. This is clearly the first person Mother has come across on the island in some time. The sonnet game Washing Ashore several years later, as discovered by the Boy in Black, was a way to further highlight this idea of concurrent cultures. That we are currently in a period when both Romans and Egyptians were navigating the oceans at the same time, and that Egyptians were close by. Remember, the island moves. It is incredibly likely that the island is somewhere in the Mediterranean at this point in time. Perhaps not too far away from the coast of Tunisia. Mother takes credit for giving the boy the game in order to convince him that there is nowhere else beyond the island, because she is grooming him to become her replacement. Further points of evidence that Across the Sea predates the Egyptian period on the island are more obvious. The stone cork and the completed donkey wheel chamber both feature hieroglyphic symbols, suggesting these were constructed and installed by the Egyptian settlers. We see the Man in Black building an early version of the wheel, but he is prevented from completing the work by Mother. She buries the chamber. Many years later, the Man in Black will influence the Egyptians to complete his work. How do we know this? Because there are hieroglyphs in the finished donkey wheel chamber, which tell us that Egyptians finished construction on the wheel. We also know that the Man in Black is transformed into the smoke monster by being sucked into the open aperture of the source. If the stone cork was already in place down there, then he would not have transformed at all. He simply would have died slowly from the radiation exposure, like the bodies Desmond comes across. Here is a screenshot of the cave before the cork is installed. Look at how beautifully bright the light is. Now, here is a screenshot of the cave 2,000 years later, with the cork blocking the light. Its brightness has vastly diminished because it has been plugged up. Let's look a little more closely at the cork. 4 lines of ancient script can be glimpsed on the top. The upper 2 lines are Egyptian hieroglyphs, while the bottom 2 are cuneiform script. The translations are as follows. Line 1. Embrace that which the balance hath weighed, let a path be made for the Osiris in the great valley, and let the Osiris have light to guide him on his way. Now, Osiris was the ancient Egyptian god of the dead and the underworld. He was the god of the resurrection into eternal life, and stood in judgment of the deceased. Does that sound like anyone we know? The smoke monster was seen by Egyptians as a separate entity from the actual form of the man in black. His appearances as dead people would not have been understood as the smoke monster replicating the deceased loved ones, but literally him resurrecting them. Hence why the Egyptians worshipped the man in black in his smoke form. To them, he was Osiris. Which also explains why he is depicted alongside Anubis on the chamber wall beneath the temple. Anubis was a close ally of Osiris. He was the Egyptian god of mummification and the afterlife as well as the patron god of lost souls. The Great Valley is clearly a reference to an afterlife, much akin to the flash sideways. We know that the source is where all life flows out from, so perhaps the Egyptians considered this hole in the cave to be the literal gateway to the afterlife. Their very own Great Valley. Line 2 on the cork, he hath reconciled the two fighters, Horus and Set. The guardians of life. Again, this suggests that the Egyptians had projected their own mythology onto the conflict between the two brothers of Jacob and the man in black. Their struggle resembled that of the Egyptians' ancient Osiris myth, which is considered the most important Egyptian myth. Set was a god who usurped and killed his own brother, Osiris. This led to another conflict with his other brother, Horus. Both Set and Horus battled for control of the throne and kingship. This suggests that the man in black and Jacob are the two fighters mentioned on the cork, and that the Egyptians were split between these two guardians of life. One of whom was a real guardian of life, and the other who was a god of death. Line 3 translates as, break the immovable yoke that we may sleep. The yoke was a type of harness created for chariot horses. In other words, it was an unbreakable link between two beings. To break this link would mean that the Egyptians could finally sleep. Sleep is another way of saying death. The final line reads as, that silence may reign and we may sleep. The silence most likely means, an end to the conflict between Jacob and the man in black. And that the dead can finally be at rest. It is only at the end of the series that we see the silence, aka an era of peace, come to the island. Because the immovable yoke has finally been broken. The Egyptian prayer finally delivered. Fans have noted that these bottom two lines on the stone cork are inscribed in cuneiform script, which was also used throughout the Egyptian period and right up to the Common Era. Another example that demonstrates the chronology of events is Jacob's tapestry in the statue. It depicts the story of the Egyptian civilization that existed on the island. A pair of wings are outstretched from an encircled eye of Horus, the god that the Egyptians perhaps believed Jacob to represent. The eye is a symbol of protection, royal power, and good health. The image also depicts 17 long arms emanating like rays out from the eye, pointing towards and touching his followers, as if choosing or selecting them to come with him to the island. We know that Jacob's touch is considered a gift. The other symbols and imagery on the tapestry appear to depict Jacob's utopian vision of what a harmonious island looked like, before the man in black corrupted it. The Egyptians used jugs to fill the water from the spring, and play music and dance. And celebrate life. They harvest crops and build a home. They live in peace. Until the day comes in which they had to leave behind the island. The tapestry ends with the representation of the departure, moving away from the island. Either to escape it, or from being banished. Notice the missing piece in the corner. It was ripped off by Jacob and used as an effective visual message to Alana at the cabin. The original tapestry would have looked something like this. As we see, Jacob has a very clear affinity for this Egyptian culture, as demonstrated by the tapestry, and the use of an ankh as his own personal crest. Dogon automatically knows the message inside of it is legitimate. And let us not forget Jacob's choice to reside inside the statue itself. Why would he have any affinity for a culture that died out long before he was ever there? There would be no reason for him to cling to these symbols and this history if he never had any interaction with it. In the commentary for Across the Sea, showrunners Damon Lindelof and Carlton Cuse actually confirm this historical chronology. Damon Lindelof says, if I were to have a theory that apparatus we see in the finale with the stone sticking in the middle of the pool that's sort of blocking the light, maybe that apparatus wasn't created until after this event. Carlton Cuse responds, I think that's an incredibly likely deduction, Damon. We have established that the Egyptians created and placed the cork in the cave. They also built the water runoff system, which appears to channel light-infused water from the source directly into several tunnels. These tunnels no doubt connect to the temple spring several miles away, which is also adorned in hieroglyphs both above and below. Plus, we see Egyptian engravings depicting the smoke monster being summoned from beneath the temple. Now, let's connect all of these dots to deduce the probable events that unfolded during the Egyptian period. They came to the island seeking a new world, away from the dying civilization under Roman rule. Perhaps Jacob hoped that they would demonstrate the good of mankind by living harmoniously on the island. Surely, this might prove to the man in black that he had been wrong and that the island was worth protecting. However, Jacob did not want to get involved. Perhaps he didn't quite know how to, especially considering he had no social skills or any real understanding of human nature. And this left the Egyptians open to external manipulations. The Egyptians lived on the island for a very long time, as evidenced by the infrastructure they built there. The statue of Tauret no doubt took many years to construct. Tauret was the ancient Egyptian patron of childbirth and a protector of women and children. This was likely erected as a monument to the island's healing properties and its power to give life. Wounds, ailments and illnesses could heal, whereas elsewhere they would certainly be fatal. Procreation thrived amongst the settlers and new life was born regularly. Their settlement was based in, what Rousseau referred to as, the Dark Territory. It is here they built the early infrastructure that would later become the temple. We can deduce that the purpose of this particular structure was to worship the smoke monster. Judging from the hieroglyphs in the chamber beneath the outer wall, the man in black made this place his home before Jacob's healing spring was ever created. Smokey wanted to stay close to the newcomers on the island. At this point, it is almost certain that he wasn't killing indiscriminately. He thought these people could still be of use to him, especially seeing as Jacob was refusing to engage or interfere. The man in black wanted to use the Egyptians in the same way he had used Claudia's people. As a means to an end. The Egyptians worshipped the man in black in his smoke monster form, possibly mistaking him for the ancient Egyptian god Osiris because of his ability to seemingly manifest and resurrect the dead. His human identity as the man in black would have been viewed as a separate entity altogether. They summoned the black smoke for guidance, instruction, and judgment. He was both a source of knowledge to them, and potentially a weapon. An extensive network of tunnels were constructed around the worshipping chamber and ran beneath the island itself. These underground structures included an outpost summoning chamber in a clearing that we will later come to know as the Dharma Barracks. Perhaps the tunnels were initially built as a literal underworld for the smoke monster to inhabit. Or, perhaps the Egyptians had started digging up the earth in search of something else entirely. We know that the smoke monster still uses these underground tunnels to get around right up until contemporary times. This is why he explodes out from beneath the ground through vents and uproots trees. Let's pause to talk about the summoning chamber outpost. People often wonder how it exactly works in regards to its functionality. We can assume that the water draining down the sinkhole activates an ancient counterweight system. A counterweight that connects to the smoke monster's chamber beneath the temple. Think of how the flush lever works on a toilet, draining the cistern of water to flush out a pipeline to a lower level. This counterweight shift alerts Smokey to the call. Maybe water fills up his space and forces him out from his den. And he leaves the temple grounds to see what's up. Meanwhile, the counterweight eventually moves back into position, pushing the muddy water and the plug lock back up through the hole to seal it up again. We will circle back to this chamber's purpose later. The temple grounds became the Egyptian settlers' primary domain. It is unclear if they built the outer wall to be a strategic stronghold or simply to conceal their place of worship, or possibly both. The focal point of this fenced-in area was the smoke monster's chamber, from which the man in black no doubt disseminated his instructions to his followers. One of the orders we can be certain that he gave to them was to seek out the light beneath the island. He wanted to finish the work that he had started with Claudia's people. The man in black then directed him to finish his work building the wheel chamber. It has often been asked if the donkey wheel chamber we see the man in black constructing in across the sea, is the same chamber that resides beneath the orchid site in the future. There were many wells that Claudia's people appear to have dug during their time on the island. The man in black explains to Jacob that
there are very smart men among us, men who are curious about how things work. Together we have discovered places all over this island where metal behaves strangely. When we find one of these sites, we dig. And this time we found something.
We even see the remnants of a well that failed to reach an electromagnetic pocket and was abandoned. In which Desmond is pushed into centuries later. If we really look at the well in Across the Sea and compare it to Orchid Site, they are clearly different locations. One is in an open wooded area, while the other is deep in the jungle. Mother buried the first site under the earth, effectively destroying all of the work down there. The second site was created many years later, long after the statue of Tauret had been built. After finding Sawyer's rope in the ground, a group of Egyptians excavated the ground to see where the rope led them. They built a well in which they could descend into the earth. Then forge a tunnel towards the light. And this is how we know beyond any doubt that the man in black had the Egyptians in the palm of his hand. Because the wheel system they construct is identical to that of his design in Across the Sea. It was surely the man in black's hope that he might still be able to escape the island in this way. If he turned the wheel, it would transport him off the island. He would be free. However, instead, this was the moment that he finally realized there was genuinely no escape from the island. At least not for him. The wheel was turned, and something moved. But it wasn't him, and the consequences of this very first turning of the wheel is what potentially caused the ancient incident on the island. The wheel channeled a large surge of energy from the light. When the island moved location in this completely unnatural way, it may have destabilized the core of the source itself. Jacob would have then been forced into action. We know that only the island protector could find the heart of the island, which means Jacob would have led a group of the Egyptians to the cave. The light had been diminished and the source was now at a very real risk of burning out. But this is also what made it possible for human beings to enter the cave without suffering the same fate as Jacob's brother. The only way to keep the light on was to plug up the hole and create a coolant system with the water. We do see that corking the source to stop it from burning out was not without consequences. People could still be irradiated by the close proximity to the light. In exchange for helping Jacob to plug this leak and the sacrifices it would require, the Egyptians were granted permission to build the water runoff system that would channel the island's healing properties directly into their sacred grounds, thereby creating a spring. This would of course taken some time to construct. The levels of radiation from this incident would have eventually cost the lives of many of the workers down there. As a result of this bargain with Jacob, they walled off the smoke monster's worshipping chamber beneath and built over it. Hence why there was no clear way to access the chamber for Ben in Season 5 episode, Dead is Dead. It is also why the others were seemingly unaware of the existence of this chamber, because it had long since been buried. The healing spring became the new focal point of these sacred grounds. And this might have caused a split between the Egyptian settlers, those that still aligned with the man in black, and those that now sided with Jacob. Which brings us back to the summoning chamber outpost that we see Ben using in Season 4 and Season 5. The existence of this place might very well have been the result of the Egyptians splitting between their two gods, Horus and Set, and so there became two warring Egyptian factions on the island. Jacob was the giver of life. The man in black was the gatekeeper of death. Those that aligned with the man in black needed a new home from where they could summon him. In Lost, history is always repeating itself, so perhaps what was taking place thousands of years ago was not too dissimilar to what we see playing out in the modern era between different warring factions.
They come, fight, they destroy, they corrupt. It always ends the same.
It only ends once. Anything that happens before that, it's just progress.
I would be remiss to not mention the other iconography at the temple. The interiors around both the temple spring and the smoke monster chamber are clearly Egyptian in design, as evidenced by hieroglyphics and architecture. However, many other aspects of the structure built above and around these ancient chambers appear to have different cultural influences. The architecture of the main temple building itself actually resembles that of the ancient Mayan temples, with hints of the old Hindu temples from the Vedic period. Based on glimpses of external iconography, the temple was clearly occupied by many different cultures and civilizations over the years, as there are both Buddhist and Hindu influences present. These cultures appear to have built upon the Egyptians' initial structures, adding to the architecture over time. But the healing pool is what everything appears to have built around, with the smoke monster's chamber long since forgotten. Which means the others were just many in a long line of groups to occupy this territory and treat it as a sacred place. Jacob brought these groups to the island across centuries, and many of them made these grounds their home because of the spring and the outer wall's fortification. It is unknown how the Egyptian civilization ended on the island, but Jacob's tapestry suggests that many of the Egyptians left the island in boats of their own accord, possibly to escape escalating conflict with the man in black and tribal infighting, or possibly out of banishment. I like to believe that Jacob actually bonded with some of the Egyptians that followed him, and this is what reinforced his belief about the good within people, and also enriched his life to the point where he adopted the cultural attitudes and symbols. So, maybe he was sending away his friends so they would not suffer any more losses at the hands of war and his brother's growing malevolence. We know that those who remained on the island were eventually wiped out, either by the Man in Black, or general human conflict. Jacob confirms as much to Richard in Ab Aeterno.
Before you built my ship, there were others?
Yes, many.
What happened to them?
They're all dead.
All that remains of these people by the time Oceanic 815 crashes are some ancient ruins and old relics from a time that has long since passed into memory and myth. Until the next time, stay lost.